Hello, welcome to another reading of Curtis Jones' writing, another presentation. We're going to read chapter 8 today. It is entitled The Reluctant Robber, and this is some family history that's passed down through our family. My father told me that his grandfather, uh, which was a white man, married to an Indian woman, my grandmother, Margaret Elizabeth, and hard times fell upon them, and he decided to go rob a stage. And that's what this story is about. And I've heard this family history most of my life. I suspect it's probably true because times can get pretty hard. There was no safety nets like there are today. So we'll start off with this, and it's a fairly lengthy read, but we'll get through it. Just be patient with me. The Reluctant Robber. My father had told me of the old days, as your fathers have told you. Now I will tell you of the hard days that come to all men. My name is Johnny Johnson. I am my father's oldest son. I have been, I have seen very hard days indeed. The days that drive men to desperation and unlawful pursuits. The time of dust and dry days had descended upon us after I had married and raised my family, or raised a family of my own. The eldest being a 12-year-old and the youngest a mere 6-month old. My eldest was a doctor named after my own dear mother, Maggie, is what we called her, but her name was Margaret Elizabeth. She knows of what I speak, being my eldest child, and she had seen what it was to go hungry. We lived in a place called Hungry Mountain. It is near Tahlequah in the Indian Territory that you now call the state of Oklahoma. Tahlequah was and still is the capital of the Cherokee people. I worked a farm and depend upon the rains to feed my family and my livestock. This year, there had been many months to grow the crops. There had not been many months to grow the crops. The freezing came late and killed everything, and I had to plant 3 times this year. And the rains would not come when the weather warmed up. We had enough food for half of the summer, and by July, we were destitute of food. I hunted, but because there were so many men hunting big game, was very hard to find, and it was scarce. Most hunters' trips came up empty. Though I was a good hunter, as we lay down to sleep, we began to hear our children cry from the hunger. They were crying themselves to sleep more often as the year without rain continued. It was the worst summer I had ever seen. I hope you never know the heartbreak in that person's life who has to listen to their children as they starve. It is an unbelievable pain for the parents. Our livestock began to die, and we ate them, but it was not possible to keep the meat, and much spoiled. We dried what we could, but we had little sunshine. The meat stayed moist, and so it spoiled easily. We were learning to eat from the woods things that other animals would not eat. All of the neighbors were in the same situation. We were starving to death. Every week, one of the neighbors had to bury a child or two from starvation. By October, we had to bury our youngest child, my dear son, one child who had done no wrong and was completely innocent of all sin. Maggie began dealing with less food to share with the children. The death of her baby bothered her and it hit her very hard. Maggie herself would soon become sick, and I knew that it was just a matter of time until she would die as well. Maggie was the only child that would be able to help in the woods and to help run our farm. That night, I thought of every possibility to save my child and children at home. I decided that I would not allow my wife and my children to die from my not being able to supply their needs. I set a plan in my heart to rob a stagecoach of its treasure. I knew I could not rob anything near where I lived. I would have to go far on my hunting expedition, looking for a good place to rob a stagecoach. I found a small town called Evansville, Arkansas, just across the border with the territory. It was 40 miles east of Hungry Mountain. There were few people that lived in the area. I should be able to accomplish my purpose and never be seen, going or coming. This coach carried the payroll for the garrison at Fort Gibson in the Indian Territory, and it comes from Fort Smith, Arkansas. It should have a large deposit of cash that is paperback and gold coins and silver coins. The Army paid in cash, and I knew I could get the stagecoach, the strongbox, off the stagecoach if I had a good plan. Pardon me. I may have to take a sinus pill. I looked at the trail they came from Fort Smith and rode up and down it for several miles each direction. I knew I had to be away from all the houses that were in the area. I needed a very isolated place to do my work. I didn't know what I would do to rob the stage yet, but I knew I would. As I rode up, I came to a place that was at the top of the hill, and the trail was very narrow there. There were there was a steep embankment on one side, and the other side a cliff that went down several hundred feet. I sat and watched the coach pass. It came through once a week, and I knew that the payroll would be on the last coach of the month. The soldiers were paid on the first of the month, and the money had to be there to do that. The place I had settled or selected was just wide enough for the team of four horses and the coach to pass. The side with a steep bank had trees growing on it. There were big trees with 30-inch trunks. I knew I could drop one of the trees, causing it to fall on the narrow road, and the stage would have to stop to clear it. I had seen a place back down the hill where they had cleared a fallen tree before. It would not be unusual to have a fallen tree, and I would have to dig out part of the root system and let the tree fall on the road naturally. If I chopped it down, they would know to be on guard. The plan seemed to be a sound plan, and I would come back in 2 weeks, and 2 days before the stage, I would need ropes to tie the tree so that it would not fall before the appointed time. I had enough rope at home. I went back home and tried to keep myself calm, but that was almost impossible. Were my fears and where he were over that might go, what things might go wrong, made it hard to sleep. My wife knew something was wrong and asked me what it was. I lied and said nothing was wrong. I was not going to tell her my plans. She would stop me. Our need was too great and our resources too small. I tried to do my work, but the thought that I might be killed or that I might be made rich was always on my mind. The last 4 days of the month rolled around, and I told my wife I was going hunting over in Arkansas, and I set out early in the morning with a shovel and an axe. I was going to dig the roots out and cut the main root and push it over the road. It would stop the stage, and then they would have to get off to clear the road, and I would just take the strong box and leave. I carried my guns just in case I needed it. I hoped that I would not stay long enough to need a firearm. As I rode toward Evansville, I became lighthearted from the fear that overwhelmed me. The excitement gave me strength to continue. I arrived about noon at that place I had selected. I looked the trees over and I picked the best one to block the road. It was leaning toward the road already. Both sides of the road were very steep and difficult. If it fell just right, the leaves on the tree would conceal me as I retrieved the strongbox. I began to dig out the root ball and clear the ground around the tree. I wanted it to look as though it had fallen naturally and not been a trap set to rob the stage. I dug for several hours, and the tree was almost ready to fall. I tied the rope around the trunk high in the tree and attached two other trees behind it. The rope was tied so I could pull on it and it would release to fall across the road. I knew that they would check why it had fallen, and if they suspected foul play, they would be on guard. I threw a shovel full of dirt over the marks that were made by the axe. I used this to camouflage what I had done. I stayed back on the bank far enough to not be seen by people passing on the road below. There was not much traffic, but I didn't want to take any chances of being seen. If all went well in the robbery, I would never be seen. My best hope is that there would not be any passengers on the stage. It should come early afternoon and I would be ready. I spent the next few hours so upset I became sick. When I heard the stagecoach coming up the hill with all fear left me. I pulled on the rope to release it so it would fall over the road within their hearing. The tree stood for several seconds and I began to push hard on it and it finally gave way. At first, it moved very slowly toward the road. Then, with a mighty crack, it fell across the road and blocked it completely, pointing down the path. It could not have fallen better for me and my plans than it did. A wagon was coming up the road and not the stage. It was a freight wagon with a big burly mule skinner driving it. It was It also came from Evansville, which was north of the tree. I thought this would cause such a great difficulty in my plans. I began to feel my heart pounding against my chest. I could feel the pulse in my jawbone. I couldn't swallow my own spit from the strain that came upon me. My first thought was that I should run away so he would not beat me to death. I could not shoot him, for the stage might hear. What was I to do about the wagon? I scouted downhill just a little further and watched as the freight driver checked out the tree and how it had fallen. He was convinced that it had fallen by the act of nature and the heavy wind that had blown 2 nights ago. This was a great benefit for my plan. It was a very lucky break he came along. He had time enough to check the tree and why it had fallen. He would convince the stage guard of what I had hoped. The mule skinner was still standing there and thinking how he could clear the road when he heard the rumble from in the valley on the stage road. I also heard the stage coming up the road, and I listened as it arrived at the fallen tree and the freight wagon just beyond. They began to talk about the bad luck to have a tree fall across the road and causing them to have to clear it. The mule skinner said he had a case of axes, and if the stage driver and his guard would help, they would have the road cleared in an hour or so. The axes were very sharp, he said. The driver and the guard asked if the wagon uh, driver would help them keep watch on the coach, and he agreed. And soon nobody was watching the stage, but the axes were cutting and chipping. Chips were flying. I was very relieved for my good luck. This was my opportunity to succeed. What had looked at first to be a disaster turned out to be a windfall for me. I watched as the guards rarely looked up to the stage. He could not make he could not make sure the box was left alone. All three men chopping on the tree, and their attention was focused on the sharp axes. From the vantage point, I could see the mule skinner never looked up once. The other two only looked rarely. I crept slowly and silently toward the stage, keeping out of sight of in case they looked. When I got there, I discovered there were no passengers on the stage. This too was my good fortune. Now all I had to do was quickly climb into the driver's seat and grab the strongbox. I had to do this without being seen or heard. I began to concentrate so intensely upon the task at hand that I heard very little sound, even the wood chips hitting the ground. It seemed as though everything had been amplified, and I was sure that they would hear me as well. My hands became sweaty and my knees were weak, so that I wasn't sure I could climb up on the stage. I knew I must finish what I had started. My family was still hungry, and without this, there was no hope. I began to sweat from the forehead. It got in my eyes, and I could no longer see clearly, but I was committed to the plan. As I walked along the off side of the stage as quietly as I could, then I climbed onto the side, showing a little bit of myself, or as little bit of myself as possible. I reached over the floorboard and took hold of the strong box, and I tried to lift it out, but it was too heavy for just one hand. I had to climb higher now, and I was more easily seen. My pulse was so hard that I thought I was having a heart attack, but I kept up the work. With both hands, I was just able to pull the strong box from under the seat, and the box was so heavy that it pulled me to the ground as I cleared the coach. I hit the ground with a thud, just then, the guard looked up from his chopping and stopped for a moment. I thought he was looking straight at me because I could see him clearly between the horse's legs. The guard asked if anyone heard anything. They all answered no, and that he should get back to the work of clearing the road. They said if anyone were to try to rob us, they would come in with guns drawn and ready to shoot us. They all went back to work on the tree trunk, and I slid down the steep hill and waited and walked back for 100 yards before climbing back across the road and hurrying back up to my horse. I rode like the wind as far away as my horse could carry me because he got tired, or before he got tired. Uh, I must have traveled 3 or 4 miles in that 10 minutes. I was in the middle of the woods with no trails and no sign of man anywhere. I set the strong box on the ground and I shot the lock off. I began to open the strong box so I could look inside. My mouth opened in surprise. It was more money than I had ever seen in my whole life. I thought I must have got $500 from the robbery, but there was 10 times that in this box. I knew that they would be looking for this before the day was over. Within the box, its contents were divided into thirds. In the center was paperback money. The left side had silver coins and the right side had gold coins. Joy flushed my skin and I felt hot all of a sudden. Then came to my mind a vision of 15 men with guns drawn and thundering down upon me in a blaze of bullets. I knew I would not survive. Now the onset of reality of what I had just done made my knees weaker. I looked at the strong box and dumped its contents into a burlap sack. I had brought the bag with me to carry the loot. It took the strong box. I took the strong box and I carried it to the deep water hole on the creek and threw it into the water with a big stone to sink it. I had hoped that the sight of a man riding with a gunny sack tied to his saddle horn would not draw any attention. I went a long way around the town of Stillwell to avoid being seen by anyone. I rode in the creek beds everywhere I could. I didn't get home until almost midnight. I put my horse in the barn. I took my gunny sack and dug a pit to hide it. Then I set the bales of hay over the pit. I went into the house and sat down at the table, and I could feel my heart racing like I had just run from a bear. I knew that feeling because I had escaped a bear before. I was almost calmed down when I heard a loud crash from the other room. I almost swallowed my tongue. It was my wife getting up because she had heard me come in and she wanted to see if I needed any help cleaning what I had brought home. When she came into the kitchen, she knew something was wrong and she kept asking me until I broke down. I began to cry softly as I confessed what I had done. I was ashamed of myself. I it started as I put the loot in the gunny sack, and the shame I felt that day has never left me. My wife sat there for several minutes and said nothing. Then she slowly raised her view to look me in the eyes. She said, "This money is a curse on you, and it will bring nothing but heartache to your life. You cannot keep it, and you cannot spend it. It will bring your house down with a great cloud of destruction and sharing." She said, "You could not return it, or they would put you in prison and keep you there for the rest of your life." She said, "And the kids would suffer for this sin as well." She said, "Take the money and bury it someplace far away. Don't get caught and don't bring it back." We went to bed and I slept like the dead until the next afternoon. When I got up, I set about building a box of very hard wood that should keep them in the ground. Though I still felt shame, I wanted the treasure to be used by my offspring after it had been forgotten by the army. I went into the woods and found a bodark tree, and I cut it down. I brought pieces back to the house to build the box that I needed. I made the box 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 6 inches deep. that was big enough to put all of the loot into it. The box was just big enough for the gold coins to take up 1/3 of the box. The gold coins take up 1/3 of the box. There was $20. There was $20 in gold pieces. That's what it was made up of. And the greenbacks took up 1/3 of the box. They were ones, fives, and $10 bills. The silver coins took up the last third of the box, and they were all silver dollars. I had determined to pass it on to my daughter Maggie and her family when they found themselves in need. I spent the next 2 days building the box. I placed all of the loot into the box and I put it together with drilled holes and pegs. Then I soaked it in water to seal up the box airtight. I placed the silver coins on one side and the gold coins on the other, and the paperbacks in the center. I called Maggie and showed her the treasure and told her that we would bury it for her family when she had need like this. I put the top on and poured water over it because I wanted it to swell tight. The next morning I took Maggie and the box and we rode along the river to a hollow that ran west. This hollow was just north of Tahlequah. We rode to the head of the hollow. We didn't turn north and rode to the head of a small hollow. We got off the horse there and I showed Maggie where I was going to bury the treasure. While I buried the treasure, Maggie made us lunch. I told Maggie not to get the treasure until she had a family and they had need of it. I told her she should wait at least 20 years, and Maggie never did retrieve the treasure because she had heard what her mother told her father. She believed the treasure was cursed. They rode back to their home and never spoke of the treasure again. Then Maggie, who was my grandmother, was on her deathbed. She described to my father where her and her father had buried the treasure. No one had ever found out that my great grandfather was the one who robbed the stage near Evansville, Arkansas. He never enjoyed a single penny of this robbery. As far as I know, no one else has ever located the treasure either. I hope you enjoyed this story. It was a true family history story that happened in the early 1800s, but it was amazing. God bless you. Take care of you. And I'll come back with another story shortly.